You ever think moving into a quiet cabin would give you peace? Well, think again. My so-called HOA didn't just send letters or fines, they sent thugs. Real ones. And when they showed up at my door, they weren't ready for the kind of lesson I had waiting. By the end of that night, they weren't walking out. They were crawling. The first signs that the HOA was plotting something against me came quietly at first, almost like whispers on the wind. Living out in a cabin surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, I thought I had left the chaos of neighborhoods and petty rules far behind. But the HOA didn't believe in boundaries. They said their jurisdiction stretched even this far, that my land, my hard-earned sanctuary, was still under their authority. It started with letters that looked official, stamped with their insignia and dripping with legal jargon meant to intimidate. They accused me of violating community standards, even though I wasn't living in their gated suburb. They claimed my cabin wasn't up to code, and that my woodpile stacked by the shed was a fire hazard. I laughed at the absurdity at first, tossing their papers straight into the fireplace, but the persistence was unnerving. Every week, like clockwork, another envelope would arrive, thicker than the last, filled with threats of fines and legal action if I didn't comply. Then the notices turned into visits. Men in suits, pretending to be inspectors, would stroll up my dirt road as if they owned the place, clipboards in hand, scribbling notes while circling my property. I confronted one of them once, asking under what authority they had to step foot on my land. He smirked and said, "The HOA has rights here. You'll learn that sooner or later." His arrogance struck me, but what really got under my skin was the way he looked at my cabin, as if it already belonged to them. From then on, I kept my eyes open. My instincts told me this wasn't just about rules or paperwork. They wanted control, and if I didn't give it, they were prepared to take it. Neighbors I barely knew began acting strange around me. When I'd go into town for supplies, a few would glance my way, then quickly look down, as if afraid to be seen talking to me. I overheard whispers in the general store about how the HOA had their sights set on the stubborn guy in the cabin. The tension was thick, an invisible pressure pushing down harder with each passing day. I couldn't help but notice the black SUV parked down the road on more than one occasion, tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. It never stayed long, but it always appeared on the days a new letter landed in my mailbox. Coincidence? I didn't think so. Late one night, I heard footsteps crunching in the gravel outside. My cabin sat far enough off the main road that no one would come wandering by accident. I peeked out the window and saw the glow of flashlights scanning the edge of the tree line. Two men stood whispering near the gate, pointing toward my porch. I stayed quiet, watching, memorizing their faces in the dim light. They didn't knock or announce themselves. They just prowled around before disappearing back into the dark. The next morning, I found boot prints in the mud near my shed. That was the moment I knew they weren't just testing me. They were preparing for something bigger. I started making preparations of my own, reinforcing the locks, setting up motion lights, and keeping a close watch on the road leading up to the cabin. I wasn't about to be caught off guard. Their threats had crossed a line, and now it was personal. The cabin that had once been a quiet retreat now felt like a fortress under siege. Every sound in the woods made me tense. Every creak of the floorboards at night had me reaching for the weapon I kept by the bed. And through it all, the letters kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last, as if they were trying to break me down with paper cuts before sending in something far worse. It became clear that this wasn't about fines or rules anymore. The HOA wasn't just pushing back against me. They were setting the stage for a confrontation. And deep down, I knew the day was coming when they would stop hiding behind letters and legal threats, and instead, they would send someone who wouldn't bother with words at all. It was late on a Friday evening when I first realized the HOA was done playing games. The night had settled into that heavy silence only the deep woods can provide, where every sound carries like a warning. I had just finished stacking the last of my firewood when I noticed the faint crunch of tires on gravel down the narrow road leading to my cabin. No one ever came out here without a reason, especially at that hour. I killed the lantern on the porch and stepped back into the shadows, watching as a pair of headlights crawled slowly toward my driveway. The vehicle was unfamiliar. An older, dark-colored van with windows blacked out so heavily that not even the interior glow of the dash was visible. When it stopped just short of my gate, I felt that cold rush of instinct, the kind that tells you trouble has arrived. The doors creaked open, and 3 men stepped out, none wearing uniforms or badges, but all carrying themselves like they owned the ground they walked on. They weren't dressed like neighbors coming by to chat. Either dark clothing, gloves, and caps pulled low to hide their faces. One of them carried what looked like a clipboard tucked under his arm, trying to maintain the illusion of being official. But the way he scanned the tree told me this wasn't a courtesy call. My gut clenched when I saw the bulge under one man's jacket, the kind that only came from a weapon. They thought they could scare me into submission. They thought I'd open the door and fold like every other poor soul who gave in to the HOA's intimidation tactics. They approached the porch with slow, deliberate steps. The man in front knocked hard enough to rattle the doorframe. I stayed quiet, watching through the small crack in the curtain. "Open up," one of them barked. "We're with the HOA. We need to discuss your violations." His tone wasn't the kind you'd expect from an official representative. It was sharp, commanding, like an order meant to force compliance. I didn't move. He knocked again, harder this time. Another voice muttered, "He's in there." Lights were on. When I still didn't answer, they started walking around the cabin, testing windows and checking the shed. I could hear the crunch of their boots circling closer, the beams of their flashlights slicing through the darkness. My heart pounded steady but strong, adrenaline pushing me into focus instead of fear. These weren't inspectors. These weren't neighbors. These were hired thugs sent under the HOA's orders to make sure I bent the knee. The clipboard was just a prop, something they'd wave around if I dared to question their presence. Their real message came through loud and clear in their body language, their threats, and the way they carried themselves like predators closing in on prey. One of them returned to the front, his patience running thin. He pounded on the door again and snarled, "Last chance. Open this door or we'll make you." That was the moment I realized they weren't bluffing. They hadn't come all this way just to hand me paperwork. They wanted to send a message, and they were willing to cross the line to deliver it. I felt a surge of anger rise inside me, a refusal to let anyone think they could walk onto my land and intimidate me into surrender. From where I stood, I could see the tension building in their movements. They were waiting for the signal, some unspoken agreement about what would happen if I didn't comply. The leader glanced toward the van, then back at the cabin. Another man shifted, checking over his shoulder as if to make sure no one was watching. They thought they had me cornered, that being out in the woods meant no one would hear if things got ugly. Their mistake was assuming I was unprepared, that I hadn't already seen the signs weeks before and started planning for exactly this moment. As they lingered near the door, I studied each of them, noting their height, their build, the way their eyes darted in the glow of the flashlights. Every detail mattered because I knew when the time came, hesitation would cost me. They were the kind of men who relied on fear to get what they wanted, the kind who had probably pulled this routine on others in the past with little resistance. But I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. My silence was already working against their confidence. I could sense their unease growing with each second that passed without an answer. They had expected me to come running, desperate to negotiate. Instead, I stayed hidden, letting them sweat under the weight of the unknown. When one of them finally muttered, "Let's just go in," I tightened my grip on what I had waiting just inside the door. They were about to find out that I wasn't the kind of man you could push around, and this cabin wasn't the kind of place you could break into without consequences. The HOA had made its move, and I was ready to answer it in a way they'd never forget. The moment their intimidation turned into an attempted home invasion is etched in my mind like a scar. At first, they kept up the act, banging on the door and throwing around phrases like official business and community enforcement. But their tone carried more threat than authority. I stayed still, listening, waiting to see just how far they were willing to push. That's when I heard the subtle click of metal, the unmistakable sound of a crowbar being slid from a belt or bag. My chest tightened, and I knew without a doubt that they weren't just here to scare me. They intended to get inside whether I allowed it or not. The leader gave a low command, and one of the men moved toward the side window, his flashlight beam cutting across the glass. I heard the scrape as he tested the latch, then the faint thud as he tried to force it. Another circled toward the back, the crunch of gravel fading as he slipped into the shadows. The air grew heavier with each passing second, the kind of silence that warns of an oncoming storm. I crouched low, peering through the crack in the curtain, my eyes following their every move. The clipboard was long forgotten now, tucked under the arm of the man guarding the porch while the others got to work. I could feel the anger boiling up, but I kept it locked down, forcing myself to think clearly. They believed they had me cornered, that they could breach my home and leave me too shaken to fight back against the HOA. They thought they could show up in the middle of the night, invade my sanctuary, and walk away with a victory. But the arrogance on their faces told me they hadn't considered what would happen if the man inside wasn't the type to bow under pressure. The first window rattled, the frame groaning as the intruder forced his weight against it. I shifted silently to the other side of the cabin, listening to the second thug's boots crunch through the grass at the back. He was slower, methodical, checking for a weak point. My pulse steadied even as my muscles tensed. I had prepared for this, and now the time to act was closing in fast. Every instinct screamed that hesitation would only give them the advantage. The man on the porch grew impatient. He slammed his fist against the door again, shouting, "Last warning. You think you can ignore us? You think the HOA doesn't have power out here? Open this door now." His words echoed in the night, carried by the wind through the trees, but no help was coming. They'd chosen this time carefully, when no one was around to hear or intervene. Then I heard it, the back door handle jiggle, followed by the slow creak of the hinges straining against the lock. My jaw clenched. They were in position. Another few seconds, and one of them would be inside. The clipboard thug kept glancing back toward the van, as if reassuring himself that their getaway was ready if things went wrong. That small flicker of unease told me all I needed to know. They weren't invincible. The crowbar scraped hard against the window frame, metal grinding against wood. A crack split through the silence as the glass strained under the pressure. The thug muttered something under his breath, frustrated, and then pressed harder. I knew in that instant the line had been crossed. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was a break-in, deliberate and planned. My hands tightened, every muscle braced. As the moment of confrontation drew closer, the porch thug barked again, his voice louder now, laced with a hint of nervousness. "You've got no idea what kind of trouble you're in. This is your last chance." But his words were starting to sound less like a threat and more like desperation. They had expected fear, compliance, an easy target. Instead, they were facing silence, and silence can be more dangerous than any shouted resistance. Through the corner of the window, I saw the flash of steel as the crowbar wedged under the sill. The man at the back rattled the door again, harder this time. The cabin shuddered faintly with the force. My breathing slowed, steady and controlled, my mind already calculating the next moves. They were about to find out that what they thought would be a simple intimidation job had turned into a fight they weren't ready for. The moment I turned the tables and gave them a painful wake-up call started with patience, not panic. I had let them think they were in control long enough, watching as they circled my cabin like wolves testing the fence of a pen. I knew they expected me to break, to fling the door open in a rush of fear and desperation. But instead I let their confidence build until it reached the point where their arrogance blinded them. When the crowbar finally pried a crack in the window frame and the back door hinges groaned under the weight of a shoulder pressing into them, I moved quietly into position. The shotgun I kept within arm's reach wasn't for show. It was a reminder to myself that out here, far from any police station or neighbor willing to help, my protection began and ended with me. I kept the lights low, my movements deliberate and silent. The man at the back thought he was making progress. I could hear him muttering curses as the lock resisted him. With one swift motion, I slid the heavy bar into place behind the door, ensuring he'd need a battering ram before he got through. The one with the crowbar didn't notice the shift in shadows near the window until I stepped into view. The look on his face when he realized I was standing there watching him was worth every ounce of patience I had held onto. His smirk faded, And for the first time that night, I saw hesitation flicker in his eyes. "Not so brave now, are you?" I muttered under my breath, though I didn't say it loud enough for him to hear. Instead, I raised the shotgun just enough for him to see the silhouette through the glass. He froze, the crowbar still wedged under the frame, as the realization hit him like a slap. He mouthed something I couldn't hear, then took a cautious step back, but his partner on the porch hadn't seen me yet and barked, "What's taking so long? Get it open." That was the moment I made my move. Instead of firing, I slammed the butt of the shotgun hard against the inside of the window frame, the sound cracking through the night like thunder. The thug on the other side stumbled back in shock, losing his grip on the crowbar. His flashlight beam skittered across the ground as he scrambled, his confidence evaporating in an instant. On the porch, the leader jumped, startled by the noise, and spun toward the window. His bravado cracked just enough for me to catch the flash of doubt across his face. I didn't give them time to recover. I swung the door open with controlled force, the shotgun leveled, my voice steady and cold as steel. "You picked the wrong cabin." The leader's mouth opened, ready to throw out another threat, but the words died on his lips when he looked down the barrel staring him in the face. He tried to puff his chest, to stand his ground, but the tremor in his jaw betrayed him. The third man, who had been testing the back door, came rushing to the porch only to freeze when he saw the scene waiting for him. They weren't expecting resistance, much less the kind that carried the weight of conviction behind it. These weren't men prepared for a fight. They were bullies trained to intimidate, not to bleed. I took a step forward, the crunch of the wooden floor under my boots making them flinch. The leader lifted his hands slightly, the clipboard tumbling to the ground. Forgotten. His eyes darted between me and his men, silently pleading for someone else to take the lead, but none of them moved. I didn't need to fire a shot. The look in my eyes, the unwavering grip on my weapon, and the sheer silence of my defiance spoke louder than any warning could. The thug who had been at the window took a shaky step back, his bravado shattered. The one at the back muttered, "This isn't worth it," under his breath, though he didn't think I'd hear. Their arrogance was crumbling, replaced now by the creeping realization that they had underestimated the man inside the cabin. The leader finally tried to save face, his voice unsteady as he said, This doesn't have to get ugly." But his hands stayed up, and I could see the sweat glistening on his forehead even in the dim light. They had come expecting to break me down, to drag me out into the night as proof of the HOA's power. Instead, they were the ones facing the raw truth that their control ended where my resolve began. The shock on their faces as their arrogance crumbled into fear was something I'll never forget. Just moments earlier they had been pounding on my door with the confidence of men who believed they owned the outcome of the night, swaggering with the assumption that I would cave like everyone else they had cornered. But the instant they found themselves staring down the barrel of my shotgun, their entire demeanor shifted. The smugness evaporated. Their postures, once stiff with dominance, slumped as though the weight of their choices finally landed on their shoulders. The leader, the one who had been so loud and commanding at first, suddenly couldn't find his words. His lips parted, his eyes darted, but the bravado that had fueled him was gone, leaving only raw panic in its place. The man who had tried to pry the window open looked like he'd seen a ghost. His flashlight beam shook in his trembling hand, the light scattering across the porch floor as he struggled to steady himself. I could see the sweat dripping down his temple, his chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. He had thought the crowbar was his ticket to an easy win, that a show of force would be enough to scare me into submission. Now he couldn't even look me in the eye. He stared at the ground, ashamed, as though avoiding my gaze might make him invisible. The third man, the one who had been working on the back door, froze halfway up the porch steps. His jaw clenched tight, and I noticed his hands twitch slightly, unsure whether to raise them in surrender or keep them hidden to preserve whatever pride he had left. He settled for shoving them into his jacket pockets, but even that small act betrayed the nervous energy radiating off him. They weren't just surprised, they were humiliated. They had come expecting to put me on my knees, but now they were the ones standing paralyzed, uncertain of their next move. What struck me most was the silence. The night that had been filled with their pounding fists, shouted threats, and scraping tools had suddenly gone still. None of them dared make a sound, as if the very act of speaking might provoke a consequence they weren't ready to face. Their eyes, wide and unsteady, flicked between each other like trapped animals seeking an escape route. The leader swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled to regain some sense of control. But the authority he had wielded so carelessly earlier had slipped through his fingers. I could see the calculations in their minds, each one silently debating whether to push forward or retreat. But the fear that gripped them was stronger than any misplaced loyalty to the HOA. They had come here thinking they were the hunters. Now they were cornered, realizing they had walked straight into a trap of their own making. I took a step closer, slow and deliberate, and the sound of my boot on the porch floor made the leader flinch like a child caught doing something wrong. It was in their eyes that the truth became undeniable. The man with the clipboard, once so smug, now looked at me with pleading desperation, as though begging me to let them walk away without further consequence. The one with the crowbar kept wiping his sweaty palms on his pants, his confidence shattered beyond repair. And the one from the back door couldn't hide the tremor in his hands, no matter how tightly he stuffed them in his pockets. Their fear was raw, unfiltered, and it was the kind of fear that strips a man down to who he really is. They weren't brave. They weren't strong. They were cowards dressed up as enforcers, leaning on intimidation and numbers to do the dirty work of an HOA that didn't want to get its hands dirty. Confronted with real resistance, they folded faster than I thought possible. The arrogance they carried onto my land had disintegrated, replaced by the grim reality that they were out of their depth. I didn't need to say much. My silence, my steady aim, and my refusal to break had already spoken louder than any threat could. Their fear was proof enough that the lesson was sinking in, and I intended to let it carve itself deep into their memories. Why the HOA thugs left crawling, and what happened in the aftermath, is a memory that still sends a chill down my spine when I replay it. They had come onto my land with swagger, thinking they could intimidate me into submission, but by the end of that night, they could barely stand. The leader, once full of bravado, now stood pale and trembling, his breathing ragged as sweat rolled down his temple. His hands, which had once knocked on my door with such force, were now shaking uncontrollably. He kept darting glances toward the van parked down the road, silently wishing he could vanish into it without having to face the humiliation of retreating in front of his own men. The man with the crowbar tried to speak, stammering something about a misunderstanding, but the words broke apart as they left his lips. He couldn't finish a single sentence. His confidence shattered into pieces he couldn't pick up again. His knees buckled slightly, and he gripped the porch railing for balance, the metal crowbar clattering to the ground as though it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. The third thug lingered a few feet back, his face pale, jaw clenched, trying to hold on to what little pride he had left. But the tremor in his hands betrayed him, giving away the fear that had sunk deep into his bones. I didn't raise my voice, didn't have to. My silence and the barrel of the shotgun spoke volumes. The quiet was louder than any threat, pressing down on them with an invisible weight they couldn't shake off. The leader swallowed hard, then finally muttered, "We'll leave. No trouble." His words cracked, unsteady, and I knew in that moment they were broken. They came expecting me to crawl, but it was them who now lowered themselves. Their bodies stooped, their confidence gone, their heads hung low. One by one, they backed away, their boots crunching on the gravel like a retreating army that had just realized the battlefield wasn't theirs to claim. The man who had dropped the crowbar bent to pick it up, but his trembling hands failed him, and it stayed on the ground, abandoned like a discarded weapon from a war they'd lost. I didn't move, just kept my eyes locked on them, making sure they felt the weight of their defeat with every step they took. When they reached the edge of the porch, the leader stumbled, nearly falling as his leg gave out under him. He caught himself on the railing, his pride crumbling along with his balance. By the time they made it to the van, they weren't strutting like enforcers. They were dragging themselves like men who'd barely survived a nightmare. Even as they pulled themselves inside the vehicle, Their heads kept snapping back toward me, making sure I wasn't following. Their hands fumbled with the door handles, their breath still uneven, their movements frantic. When the engine finally roared to life, the tires spun in the gravel, spraying dirt as they sped off into the night like cowards fleeing from a fire they couldn't put out. I stood there long after their taillights disappeared, the silence of the woods settling back in, heavier now, carrying with it the weight of what had just happened. The aftermath lingered in more ways than one. Word spread quickly, though I had no idea how. A few days later, I noticed people in town looking at me differently. Some glanced away the moment our eyes met, their faces pale, as if afraid to be connected to me. Others, though, gave me a nod of quiet respect, the kind reserved for someone who had done what others only dreamed of doing, standing up to the HOA and living to tell about it. No one asked questions, and no one spoke about that night openly, but the tension in the air told me that stories were circulating. The letters stopped coming. For weeks, not a single envelope showed up in my mailbox. The men in suits with their clipboards vanished, and the black SUV that had once lingered down the road was nowhere to be seen. My cabin was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It carried a new edge, a sense of watchfulness, as though the forest itself remembered what had happened. I stayed alert, knowing the HOA wouldn't take their humiliation lightly. Thugs like that didn't crawl away without leaving behind a trail of anger, and I knew sooner or later they might try again. But for now, I had bought myself peace, and I had proven a point that would echo through every whisper of their network. That night taught them a lesson they hadn't expected. They thought fear would do the job for them, but they walked away realizing that fear works both ways. I hadn't fired a single shot, yet they left crawling, broken not by bullets but by the collapse of their own arrogance. They had stepped onto my land thinking they were in control, but by the time they left, they knew without a doubt whose ground they had trespassed on, and whose will they had underestimated.